Before he drafted the laws that govern 1.4 billion people, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was a boy whose society deemed him less valuable than a farm animal. When young Bheem needed a haircut, the local village barber refused. He claimed that the mere act of touching the boy's hair would spiritually pollute him. But later that day, that same barber used those same shears to shave the hide of a village buffalo. This forces a child to answer a terrifying question. How do you survive in a system that grants more dignity to livestock than to a human being? This wasn't a social misunderstanding. Untouchability was a deliberate, systemic, psychological weapon designed to crush an individual's self-worth before they even reached adulthood. The most extreme physical rule of this system required untouchables to walk through certain areas wearing a pot tied around their neck and a broom dragging from their waist. The logic was mechanical. The pot caught their impure spit, and the broom erased their polluting footprints from the earth as they moved. This left young Bheem with two paths. He could submit to the idea that he was a subhuman pollutant, or he could actively rebel. Bheem chose rebellion. He refused to wear the pot and broom, marking his transition from a passive victim to an active rebel against the caste structure. While this physical refusal was a start, it wasn't enough. To dismantle the entire system, he would have to forge a sharper, invisible weapon. That weapon was education, and the architect of his training was his father, Ramji Sakpal. As a subadar in the army, he applied military discipline to his son's intellectual development. Ramji's strategy was to take the raw humiliation his son faced and convert it into an unrelenting pursuit of knowledge. The training was put to the test when Bheem was banished from his classroom and forced to sit outside on a gunny sack, away from the other students. Eventually, the exclusion became too much. Bheem hit a breaking point and wanted to quit school entirely. Ramji pulled him into the blazing sun, asking if the heat changed based on where he stood. He told his son education is like that sun. Sitting in the hallway doesn't diminish the knowledge shared inside. This analogy changed Bheem's entire approach to his exclusion. He stopped viewing the hallway as a cage, treating it as a vantage point for knowledge. But gathering that knowledge required a level of family sacrifice that was often painful. At one point, young Bheem secretly sold his grandmother's precious silver locket to buy a thick, worn textbook. It was a science book about buoyancy, why things sink or float. He wanted to understand the forces that kept his own people at the bottom of society. Decades later, his father discovered this alchemy became undeniable. He built a massive intellectual arsenal, 35 degrees, 9 languages, and doctorates from both Columbia University and the London School of Economics. These degrees represented the crossing of intellectual boundaries that a boy on a gunny sack was never supposed to reach. By absorbing the sun's heat from the hallway, he had transformed himself into the most educated and influential Indian thinker of his generation. He returned to India armed with that knowledge, ready to dismantle the system that had enforced the pot and the broom. His triumph was complete when he became independent India's first law minister and the chief architect of the Indian Constitution. With a stroke of a pen, he wrote the laws that legally abolished the system of untouchability that had defined his childhood. He fulfilled his father's vision, proving his own famous saying, "Education is like a lioness's milk. The one who drinks it roars." Ambedkar's life demonstrates that education is the mechanism through which systemic injustice is dismantled. He used the knowledge he was never supposed to have to reclaim a humanity that was never supposed to be his.
Imagine a personal library holding 35,000 books. Picture a scholar who earned 3 PhDs and collected 35 academic degrees over his lifetime. This chart maps the average educational attainment in early 20th century India against a single man's academic record. With 3 doctorates and 35 degrees, he achieved a level of scholarship that dwarfed nearly everyone else in his era. Yet, as a young boy, this same mind was subjected to intense humiliation. A local village barber who happily shaved the coarse hair of a buffalo flatly refused to cut young Bheem's hair, terrified that touching the boy would pollute him. This was the reality of rural agrarian India in the 1890s. Segregation here was a deeply enforced caste hierarchy where discrimination was woven into the fabric of everyday life. How did a child born into the most oppressed community in the country manage to become its most highly educated citizen? At school, Bheem was forced to sit outside the classroom on a burlap sack he had to carry from home. Once, when a teacher asked him to solve a math problem on the blackboard, his classmates rushed to grab their lunchboxes, terrified that his mere proximity to the board would spoil their food. The penalties of his caste extended far beyond the schoolyard. During a trip to Goregaon, cart drivers refused to carry him. He was eventually forced to pay double the normal fare, and even then he had to drive the bullock cart himself, while the owner walked alongside to avoid physical contact. In some regions, members of his community were forced to tie earthen pots around their necks to catch their spit, and drag crude brooms behind them to sweep away their own footprints, ensuring they left no physical trace to pollute the higher castes. His father, Ramji, a retired military officer, understood that physical resistance against such an overwhelming system was impossible. He realized the only weapon capable of fighting this deeply ingrained societal prejudice was relentless, uncompromising education. Young Bheem recognized that the line dividing society was built on dogma, not nature. He committed his life to using education to dismantle that line entirely. His intellectual pursuit eventually caught the attention of the Maharaja of Baroda, who awarded Bheem a rare scholarship. This funding provided an immediate physical escape from the confines of the Indian caste system. He arrived in New York to attend Columbia University, rapidly expanding his expertise across economics, law, and sociology. From there, he moved to the United Kingdom, enrolling at the London School of Economics, to finalize an academic toolkit that few people on Earth possessed. But when Dr. Ambedkar returned to India to take up a high-ranking military and civil position in Baroda, the illusion of progress shattered. The segregation remained completely intact. Office peons refused to hand him papers, choosing instead to throw files onto his desk from a safe distance. When his caste identity was discovered at a local Parsi inn, an angry mob armed with sticks chased him out of his room. Individual merit, high government rank, and prestigious Western degrees were powerless against the entrenched dogmas of the caste system. Realizing that personal success meant nothing without collective liberation, he shifted his focus to systemic disruption. He launched a Mukh Nayak newspaper to give a voice to the marginalized, and led the Mahad Satyagraha, marching thousands to a public tank to drink water they had been historically banned from touching. This direct action soon put him on a collision course with the most revered figures of the Indian independence movement, most notably Mahatma Gandhi. Their ideological friction reached a boiling point during the roundtable conferences in London. Ambedkar demanded guaranteed political power through separate electorates for marginalized classes, while Gandhi strongly opposed the measure, fearing it would divide the Hindu majority. Ambedkar openly rejected Gandhi's term Harijan, or Children of God, for the untouchables. He refused to accept any reform that left the orthodox Varna hierarchy intact, demanding total equality rather than mere charity. His decades of rigorous academic training equipped him with an arsenal of logic and legal precedent. He was the only intellect in the country capable of openly challenging the founding fathers and dismantling their sanitized social narratives. When India achieved independence, the new nation needed a legal framework. Ambedkar's undeniable brilliance made him the only logical choice to serve as the chief architect of the Indian Constitution and the country's first law minister. Yet, behind the scenes, the political friction was severe. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru initially resisted including Ambedkar in the Constituent Assembly, and the ruling party later actively campaigned against him in parliamentary elections. Despite opposition, he secured his place. The boy once forbidden from the school water pot authored the articles abolishing untouchability. He extended this fight, drafting the Hindu Code Bill to secure women's rights. When stalled, he resigned in protest. The newly written Indian Constitution was designed as a direct structural countermeasure to the terrible abuses he had suffered. He built legal safeguards to protect millions from the very system that had tried to silence him. In 1956, he executed a final act of liberation. Seeking a spiritual framework rooted in absolute equality, Dr. Ambedkar formally converted to Buddhism alongside 500,000 of his followers. For decades, political narratives have tried to box him in purely as a Dalit leader. but that label underestimates his impact.
He was a paramount national intellectual whose vision shaped the entire republic. From economics to sociology, from law to human rights, his intellectual spectrum remains unmatched. He dismantled oppressive traditions with the sheer force of reason and the rule of law. The boy who was once forced to sit outside the classroom ultimately drafted the blueprint for the legal house that shelters 1.4 billion Indians today.
A child born into a demographic legally barred from drinking from public water sources grows up to become the chief architect of his nation's founding constitution. To understand exactly how that happens, we cannot look at this through the lens of a standard historical biography. We have to analyze it as a masterclass in systemic reform and institutional engineering. The central challenge here is unique. How do you dismantle a social hierarchy when the enforcers are not the state police, but your own neighbors operating on deeply ingrained, unwritten societal rules? This timeline maps out the blueprint of institutional disruption we will be tracking. It occurs across three distinct historical nodes: sociological disruption in 1927, ideological confrontation in 1931, and hard institutional policy implementation in 1942. Constitutional rights are never accidents. They are the final, codified output of a calculated, multi-stage disruptive process. To understand the disruption, we first have to establish the unwritten law of untouchability that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was up against. In his childhood classroom, he was forced to sit on a separate burlap sack he brought from home, and he was strictly denied the ability to touch the school's communal water pot. These rules were underpinned by the sociological concept of purity and pollution. Under the caste system, higher castes viewed the physical touch and sometimes even the shadow of an untouchable as an active contaminant that required ritual purification. In this photograph from the era, we see the economic reality of this structure. Manual, segregated labor was strictly assigned to the lower castes. As a function of this societal hierarchy, you did not choose your profession, your caste dictated it. Ambedkar managed to bypass this physical segregation through extreme academic rigor and scholarships. He traveled to the United States and the UK, building an extraordinary intellectual pedigree that included multiple doctorates from institutions like Columbia University and the London School of Economics. But returning to Baroda, India, with elite degrees, did not neutralize his caste. When he took a high-level position in the civil service, he was still denied basic housing. In his office, his own subordinates refused to hand him documents, choosing instead to throw files onto his desk from a distance to avoid pollution. Education and individual achievement alone cannot override systemic discrimination if the foundational, unwritten laws of a society remain entirely intact. This brings us to Phase 1 of the blueprint, sociological disruption, which centers on the 1927 Mahad Satyagraha. This conceptual map visualizes the unwritten laws of purity as a rigid grid. Ambedkar's march to the Chavdar tank utilized the act of drinking water to systematically invalidate the theological concept of ritual pollution in public spaces. During this same movement, Ambedkar and his followers publicly burned the Manusmriti, an ancient Hindu legal text that codified caste discrimination. This text burning was an act of calculated rejection. Ambedkar was publicly signaling that the oppressed would no longer recognize the theological legal framework that governed their status for centuries. To build a completely new legal reality, you must first create a vacuum. You do that by breaking the psychological hegemony of the old, unwritten codes. Phase 2 is ideological confrontation, defined by Ambedkar's intense 1931 clash with Mahatma Gandhi, seen here. Gandhi sought the integration of Dalits through moral persuasion. He viewed untouchability as a social sin, a flaw that required a change of heart from the upper caste oppressors. Ambedkar, pictured here, developed a counter-framework in direct opposition to Gandhi's moral approach. This comparative matrix breaks down the conflict. Gandhi relied on trickle-down morality, asking the privileged to allow Dalits into temples. Ambedkar demanded bottom-up statutory rights. The oppressed do not need pity. They need enforceable legal codes and raw political power. During the roundtable conferences in London, seen in this photograph, Ambedkar successfully positioned the depressed classes as an independent political entity. This performance turned him into a negotiator that the British government could no longer bypass. During these debates, Ambedkar delivered a statement to Gandhi carrying profound legal weight. "I have no homeland." He was defining a state of literal statelessness, explaining that being a citizen on paper means nothing if you are entirely segregated in practice. Gandhi treated untouchability as a moral failure within an otherwise functioning social structure. Ambedkar identified it as the primary architecture of the social structure itself. Phase 3 is policy implementation. In 1942, Ambedkar strategically elevated his position, joining the Viceroy's Executive Council as the labor member. He used this specific bureaucratic appointment to shift his role from a grassroots social agitator to an institutional engineer with executive authority. This ledger tracks his legislative victory. Ambedkar forced the reduction of the mandated Indian workday from 12 hours down to 8. He then championed modern systemic labor protections, including maternity benefit laws and the dearness allowance to protect wages against inflation. Ambedkar's appointment to the council followed a decade of making the Dalit political voice an unavoidable factor in British governance. This seat provided the legislative machinery to turn years of social agitation into these specific, enforceable labor codes. In 1947, as seen in this photograph of the Constituent Assembly, Ambedkar was appointed chairman of the Constitution Drafting Committee for an independent India. This role allowed him to take his lifelong strategic framework and permanently encode it into the supreme law of the land. He secured the passage of Article 17, which legally abolished untouchability, and Article 14, guaranteeing equality before the law. These were the ultimate statutory victories over the unwritten laws he faced as a child. But the fight to engineer equality did not end with the Constitution. Ambedkar immediately faced immense resistance when attempting to pass the Hindu Code Bill, legislation designed to secure property and marriage rights for women. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, pictured here, ultimately backed away from supporting the bill in the face of conservative backlash. Frustrated by the lack of support for women's rights, Ambedkar resigned from the cabinet. Soon after, his former political allies orchestrated his defeat in the elections. True systemic engineering is a perpetual battle. Political power will always resist structural equality, even after national independence is won. Ambedkar's blueprint required 3 distinct steps: sociology breaking agitation, unyielding ideological confrontation, and rigorous policy execution. Through this method, the man most aggressively excluded by the Indian social system managed to become the principal author of its foundational legal code. In 1956, just weeks before his death, he completed his final rejection of the unequal hierarchy. As seen in this photograph of the Buddhist monks who follow his tradition today, Ambedkar formally converted to Buddhism, taking 500,000 followers with him to a faith outside the caste system. He left behind a clear precedent. Constitutional rights, human dignity, and systemic equality are never voluntarily granted by those who hold power. They must be meticulously engineered, codified into law, and relentlessly enforced. In the late 19th century, India was locked in a highly visible struggle against British colonialism. But beneath that fight lay a much older, invisible prison, a rigid system of social stratification known as caste, dividing the population from birth. Born in 1891, young Bheem Ambedkar navigated the busy streets of an India where his brilliant mind was immediately trapped. Because he was born into the Mahar community, considered untouchable, society dictated that his mere presence was a source of physical pollution. At school, Bheem was physically excluded from learning alongside his peers. He was forced to sit completely separate from the other children, often outside the classroom doors on a burlap sack from home. If he grew thirsty, school rules forbade him from touching the communal water pot. He waited for someone from a higher caste to pour water from a distance. If no one was willing, he went without. Once, when a teacher asked Bheem to solve a math problem on the chalkboard, the classroom erupted in panic. Students rushed to snatch away their lunchboxes stacked behind the board, terrified his proximity would contaminate their food. Bheem's earliest years were defined by these precise physical boundaries. Every single rule, every line drawn in the dirt,
and every withheld cup of water functioned as a calculated method to strip away his basic human dignity. To dismantle a system built on arbitrary rules, he realized he couldn't rely on physical force. Escaping an intellectual and systemic prison required forging a formidable intellectual weapon. He established a strict philosophical framework that would guide the rest of his life: educate, organize, and struggle. Education had to come first. His first act of defiance was academic. Through sheer persistence, he became the first person from his community to pass the high school matriculation exam. Securing rare scholarships, he traveled to the United States and Britain. He studied at Columbia University in New York and the London School of Economics, eventually amassing 35 degrees across economics, law, and political science, while mastering 9 languages. Ambedkar meticulously built the exact legal and economic arsenal required to dismantle the society that had actively rejected him. Returning to India with doctorates from the world's most prestigious institutions, Ambedkar carried a brief illusion. Perhaps his intense academic merit could finally outrank his caste status. Reality quickly corrected that assumption. Appointed to a high-level government job in Baroda, his lower-ranking subordinates still refused to hand him paperwork directly, instead throwing files onto his desk to avoid any physical contact. Soon after, a mob armed with sticks forced him out of a local inn, strictly because they discovered his caste identity. Ambedkar recognized that personal success meant absolutely nothing if his community remained in chains. He pivoted to the second phase of his philosophy: organize, forming the Bahishkrit Hitakarini Sabha to unite the depressed classes. Remembering the days he was denied water at school, he led thousands in the Mahad Satyagraha. Together, they marched to a segregated public water tank and deliberately drank from it, shattering a centuries-old taboo. He then targeted spiritual spaces, leading a movement to force open the doors of the Kalaram temple, reclaiming the right to enter spaces where his people were previously forbidden. Ambedkar took the specific traumas of his youth, the withheld water, the barred doors, and reverse-engineered them into highly targeted, organized public campaigns to physically break the boundaries of caste. But opening local water tanks and temples yielded only localized victories. To ensure lasting survival, the fight had to escalate to the highest levels of national policy. Traveling back to London for the Round Table conferences, Ambedkar sat across from the British Empire's leaders. He demanded that marginalized people in India be officially recognized as a distinct political minority, complete with their own electoral rights. This stance placed him in direct ideological collision with Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi vehemently opposed separate electorates for the depressed classes, fearing it would divide the Hindu majority, leading to a tense standoff and eventually the Pune Pact. Ambedkar held a firm conviction. Asking the upper castes to end untouchability out of the goodness of their hearts was a failed strategy. The oppressed needed hard, legal political power to protect their own lives. Through sheer intellectual force, Ambedkar outvoted the Dalit struggle from a plea for social charity into a hardline demand for constitutional representation. When India emerged as an independent nation in 1947, a remarkable moment of poetic justice occurred. The boy who was once forced to sit outside the classroom was asked to sit at the head of the table. As the chairman of the drafting committee in the Constituent Assembly, Ambedkar held the pen that would define the laws governing hundreds of millions of people. He took his personal history and legally dismantled it. He drafted Article 17, which explicitly abolished untouchability. He secured Article 15 to prohibit discrimination, and he ensured universal adult franchise, guaranteeing that every citizen had an equal vote. His fight for equality extended beyond caste. He introduced the Hindu Code Bill, a massive legal reform designed to secure equal property inheritance and marriage rights for women. When Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and the cabinet yielded to conservative pressure and diluted the Hindu Code Bill, Ambedkar refused to compromise. Standing on sheer principle, he resigned from his position as India's first law minister. Ambedkar proved himself to be a pure architect of justice. He consistently prioritized uncompromising legal equality over his own political career and personal power. In his later years, Ambedkar reached a final realization. He concluded that the rigid dogma of the caste system could never be fully erased from within the religious framework that created it. In October 1956, he orchestrated his final act of liberation. At Diksha Bhumi, he led hundreds of thousands of his followers in a mass conversion to Buddhism, securing a permanent space of spiritual dignity. From the dirt floor outside his primary school to the drafting of the Constitution, he completely reverse-engineered the oppressive system he was born into. He proved that true equality is never freely given. It has to be meticulously built. The legacy of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar remains the active, beating heart of the world's largest, very constitutional bedrock that holds modern India together.
When we learn about India's independence, the story usually looks like a monolith, a unified subcontinent locking arms to expel the British Empire. For millions of marginalized Indians at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, the most brutal oppressors they faced wore no British uniforms. They were neighbors. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar lived this reality from childhood. As a young student, the law forbade him from drinking communal water, and he was forced to sit on a burlap sack he brought from home, isolated in the back of the classroom. In his community, the oppression took visceral, physical forms. People were legally forced to tie clay pots around their necks to catch their spit, and drag brooms behind them to sweep away their own polluting footprints. For marginalized communities, throwing off colonial rule was only one part of the equation. The true fight for freedom meant dismantling thousands of years of systemic domestic tyranny. When a young Ambedkar tried to expose these human rights violations to the rest of the country, he hit a wall of silence. The mainstream Indian press completely shut him out. Bal Gangadhar Tilak's widely read newspaper, Kesari, outright refused to print his materials, even when Ambedkar offered to pay for the space as an advertisement. This absolute rejection led to a harsh but crucial realization. If the architects of the nation refuse to hand you the microphone, you have to build your own. He pivoted his political strategy from pure academia to independent journalism. He understood that securing legal rights required controlling the means of communication. In 1920, he launched Muk Nayak, which translates to Leader of the Voiceless. He forged an independent channel to bypass the elite media blockade entirely. This transparent approach sharply contrasted with other leaders of the era, particularly Mahatma Gandhi. To Western and liberal audiences, Gandhi cultivated an anti-caste, progressive image through his English-language newspaper, Harijan. In his Gujarati-language paper, Deen Bandhu, Gandhi delivered a completely different message. He published conservative views supporting the traditional Varna, or caste system, to appease his orthodox base. Ambedkar saw right through this targeted political messaging. Decades later, in a 1955 BBC interview, he publicly called out Gandhi's dual narratives, exposing the gap between the English progressive and the Gujarati conservative. For Ambedkar, achieving true equality meant relying on uncompromising facts. He knew you couldn't eradicate a deeply entrenched social hierarchy through politically convenient, tailored messaging. This divide in priorities became undeniable in 1930. This was the year of the globally famous Dandi March, where Gandhi challenged the British salt monopoly. 10 days before Gandhi reached the sea, a parallel, largely untelevised, struggle was unfolding: Ambedkar's Kalaram Temple Satyagraha. The contrast is staggering. While mainstream nationalist leaders fought the British Crown over the taxation of salt, Ambedkar and his followers fought their fellow Indians for the basic human right to walk inside a public temple. This peaceful demand for equality faced intense, violent opposition from the local upper caste population, a standoff that lasted for over a year. It proved a bitter reality. Securing basic human dignity from the people living right next door was a far more difficult and dangerous undertaking than taking on a global empire. We see this pragmatic defiance during the 1928 Simon Commission. Mainstream history remembers this event almost exclusively for the massive, furious boycotts mounted by nationalists. Look closer at the historical record, and a hidden thread emerges. While the Indian elite boycotted the British Commission, Ambedkar actively sat down and negotiated with it. His reasoning was ruthlessly pragmatic. The same Indian leaders demanding independence from the British were simultaneously working to block political representation for Dalits in the proposed new government. Ambedkar chose to secure concrete, legal leverage for his people over nationalist popularity. To guarantee future political rights, he had to bypass the Indian elite entirely.
Because of these fiercely independent choices, Ambedkar's contemporaries frequently smeared him as a traitor or a stooge for the British. His actions were never against the concept of India. He was fighting the systemic inequality embedded deep within its culture. This lonely pragmatism resulted in the ultimate historical irony. When independence finally arrived, the boy who was legally forbidden from drinking from a public water pot was appointed to write the supreme law of the land. As the principal architect of the Indian Constitution, he forced democratic equality into the system. He championed sweeping reforms like the Hindu Code Bill, fiercely advocating to secure equal property and marriage rights for women. True nation-building demands the immense courage to confront a society's internal rot. Ambedkar's life remains the ultimate proof that justice often requires standing entirely alone against the era's most celebrated national heroes.
In a quiet corner of a modern library, Rohan and Aisha are arguing over a heavy copy of Annihilation of Caste. Rohan asks a question that seems perfectly logical to anyone looking back. If Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was so brilliant, why couldn't he just pack up, move to a new town, and hide his background to avoid the discrimination? Before Aisha can answer, a glowing blue holographic figure slowly materializes between the towering bookshelves. It's Dr. Ambedkar himself. He looks at them and explains that identity within a rigid caste system is not a garment you can simply take off. He points them back to 1901. 10-year-old Bheem and his siblings are stranded at a railway station, terrified and desperately trying to reach their father. They had money for a ride, but drivers refused, discovering the children were Mahars, a community deemed untouchable. Driven by thirst, Bheem attempts an illusion, pretending to be Muslim to get drinking water from a toll collector. The disguise fails almost instantly. The toll collector reads his demeanor, sees right through the boy's terrified act, and violently denies him access to the well. You cannot evade systemic oppression by changing your clothes or adopting a fake name. It is an inescapable reality that hunts you down, forcing a direct confrontation. Aisha leans in, asking the hologram the next logical question. If running away was impossible, what weapons did he use? The answer was education. He amassed academic credentials at a scale few could match. He traveled to America, earning master's and doctorate degrees from Columbia University. He then crossed the Atlantic to the UK, simultaneously mastering both economics and law at the London School of Economics. By the time he returned to India, he held higher degrees than anyone in his department at the Baroda Civil Service. Yet the office peons still threw files at his desk from a distance, terrified his touch would pollute them. The tide only began to turn in 1920. That year, Shahu Maharaj, the ruler of Kolhapur, publicly backed Ambedkar, declaring to the masses they had finally found a true leader for the Dalit community. A wall full of Ivy League diplomas could not overwrite his caste. Individual intellectual achievement is powerless against deep-seated societal prejudice, without a collective, organized political mandate to force structural change. This diagram shows his first massive structural victory, the separate electorate. By fighting the British, he secured a system where marginalized groups could independently choose their own representatives, completely free from upper caste interference. But this victory hit a massive roadblock. Mahatma Gandhi fiercely opposed the separate electorate, arguing that it would permanently divide the Hindu fold. To block the measure, Gandhi began a fast unto death inside Yerwada Central Prison, holding his own life hostage to force Ambedkar to surrender. Knowing Gandhi's death would trigger mass violence against the Dalit community, he was forced to yield. He signed the Pune Karkt, giving up the separate electorate. Rohan looks up at the hologram and asks about the long-term fallout. Ambedkar explains what political leader Kanshi Ram would later call the Chamcha Age, the age of stooges. This animation illustrates the mechanics. Under the Pune Pact, an upper caste majority could now overwhelm the Dalit vote. This allowed them to elect compliant, puppet Dalit leaders who would never challenge the status quo, effectively silencing independent voices. Political compromises made within a rigged system do not yield equality. They merely manufacture the illusion of representation. By the time India gained independence, Ambedkar was the chief architect of the new constitution. He established political equality on paper,
but knew the roots of social inequality remained firmly planted. He tried to reform social laws through the Hindu Code Bill, demanding equal rights for women. Instead, he hit a wall of fierce resistance from the orthodox establishment and Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru himself. Realizing the majority would never willingly dismantle their own social privileges from within the government, Ambedkar did the unthinkable. He abruptly resigned from his position as India's first law minister. He then brought his rebellion into his personal life. He married Dr. Sharda Kabir, a Brahmin woman, deliberately shattering the strictest rules of caste endogamy. Just weeks before his death in 1956, he executed his ultimate strike against the system. He led 500,000 followers to convert to Buddhism, completely and permanently exiting the oppressive religious hierarchy. In the library, the blue light of the hologram begins to fade. But before disappearing entirely, Ambedkar delivers his enduring mandate to the students: educate, agitate, and organize. True equality is never given by those in power. It demands the courage to completely reject and overwrite the rules of an oppressive system, rather than just surviving within it.
It's 10 o'clock at night in the school library. Rohan and Aisha are hunched over a desk, surrounded by crumpled notes and half-finished caffeine, trying to make sense of a project on the psychological impact of modern bullying. Rohan drops his pen and asks Aisha the question that's been bothering him all night. How did the figures they read about in history survive years of brutal, systemic abuse without their minds simply snapping? The answer comes from the shadows of the library stacks, as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar steps into the light of their desk lamp. He tells them that when society surrounds a person with hatred, there are two paths. You can allow the pressure to shatter your spirit, or you can use that same pressure to forge your mind into a tool that eventually dismantles the entire system. To understand how a 10-year-old boy begins building that kind of armor, Rohan and Aisha need to see the environment that first tried to break him.
The library slowly dissolves into the 1901 Koregaon railway station. A 10-year-old Bheem is waiting for his father, and the memory begins to play out before the teenagers. Bheem and his siblings are well-dressed and articulate. When the station master first approaches them, he is polite, assuming from their appearance that they are from a high-status family. The master's face physically recoils the moment Bheem mentions they are Mahars. In an instant, his professional courtesy vanishes, replaced by a visible, irrational disgust. Aisha watches the scene, struggling to understand how a child processes that kind of immediate, unprovoked hatred from an adult stranger. To get home, the children hire a bullock cart, paying double the fare to drive themselves. The driver refuses to sit in the same vehicle. He spends the journey walking in the dirt, terrified of being polluted by physical proximity. Rohan and Aisha are seeing the reality of untouchability, a state-sanctioned enforcement of physical isolation that attempted to define a child's value before they even spoke. The scene shifts to his school in Satara. For Bheem, the classroom was a place of enforced segregation. He is forbidden from sitting on the benches with the other students. Instead, he spends his days sitting on a rough gunny sack in the corner of the room, a piece of fabric he is required to bring from home and take back every night. Basic survival is a daily struggle. He cannot touch the communal water pot. If the school peon isn't there to pour water from a height into his hands, Bheem simply goes through the day thirsty. When he is called to the blackboard to solve a math problem, his classmates panic. They rush forward to pull their lunchboxes away from the board, fearing that his shadow passing over their food will make it inedible. Rohan asks how this kind of daily, public humiliation doesn't destroy a person's desire to learn. The isolation creates a silence that most would find unbearable, but Bheem begins to fill that silence by returning to the books his father struggled to buy for him, like the science text he once traded a silver locket to obtain. He spent his years of forced isolation bypassing the classmates who ignored him, choosing instead to build an internal world by conversing with the greatest legal and economic minds in history. He reached a level of excellence where his critics became irrelevant. He didn't just survive the school corner, he outpaced everyone in the room. That academic drive takes him to America, where he studies at Columbia University, immersing himself in the mechanics of how societies function and fail. He continues to London, earning a doctorate of science from the London School of Economics and qualifying as a barrister. By the end of his life, he has mastered 9 languages and built a personal library of 35,000 books. He accumulated so much specialized knowledge that the very system that tried to keep him out of the classroom eventually had to ask him to write the rules for the entire nation. The final triumph is a complete reversal of his childhood. The boy who was once told his shadow could pollute food became the chief architect of the Indian Constitution. He used his education to draft the fundamental rights and legal protections that would formally dismantle the very customs that once kept him thirsty and isolated. Back in the library, Ambedkar leaves Rohan and Aisha with the core philosophy of his life. Education is like the milk of a lioness. The one who drinks it roars. A mind isolated by force can be broken, but a mind that uses that isolation to sharpen its intellect eventually writes the laws of the land. Rohan and Aisha look at their project with a new understanding of what it means to be resilient. If you found this story of intellectual survival helpful, subscribe and share this video with someone who needs to hear it.
Inside a dimly lit library, 2 students, Rohan and Aisha, are surrounded by political history textbooks, looking completely exhausted. Aisha pushes her book away in frustration. She notices that in almost every chapter, politicians seem to talk about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar only when discussing Dalit politics or voting reservations. She asks if this one demographic focus was his only contribution. The room suddenly shifts. The library lights flicker. Pages begin turning at high speed, and Dr. Ambedkar himself manifests at their table. He acknowledges their confusion. He explains that modern political narratives have often stripped away his broader work, narrowing a massive legacy down to a single label used for campaigning. He points to the evidence of his intellectual training. He mastered 9 languages and earned 35 degrees, including doctorates in economics and law from the world's most elite institutions, like the London School of Economics and Columbia University. This wasn't just for personal prestige. He used this global education as a weapon to upgrade the legal and economic foundations of India. Aisha asks what it was like for a scholar to return to India in the 1920s. We see the historical streets of Bombay, where he began his career. Despite his qualifications, upper-caste lawyers refused to share a workspace with him. He was denied a desk inside the courthouse and had to work outside on a small stone platform, or chabutara. It was on this platform that a merchant approached him with a desperate case. His young son was facing a terrible murder charge that every other lawyer in the city had completely refused to touch. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was grim. After the evidence was heard, the British judge delivered his verdict, stating simply that the boy was to be hanged. Ambedkar immediately stood up. He pointed out that while the judge said hanged, he failed to include the necessary legal phrase, till death. This technical omission halted the execution. In that courtroom, the boy's life was saved not by an appeal for mercy, but by Ambedkar's insistence on the exact legal language the judge had overlooked. Rohan asks how Ambedkar's approach compared to Mahatma Gandhi's. The setting moves to the 1930s roundtable conferences in London, where Ambedkar represented his people on the global political stage. The 2 leaders held different visions. On Gandhi's side, the focus was moral reform, asking for better treatment while keeping social hierarchy intact. On Ambedkar's side, the demand was structural equality, the total legal removal of the caste system. Ambedkar rejected Gandhi's term Harijan, or children of God. He argued that his community didn't need new names or acts of charity. They needed the legal power to govern themselves. When Ambedkar pushed for separate voting electorates to ensure his community had a guaranteed voice, he met fierce resistance from Gandhi, who saw the move as a threat to national unity. To block the separate electorates, Gandhi began a fast unto death at Yerrawada Central Prison. The survival of the national leader was suddenly tied to Ambedkar's willingness to back down. Ambedkar eventually signed the Pune Pact to save Gandhi's life, but the compromise reinforced his conviction. Moral appeals were fragile, and equality had to be written into the law to survive.
Returning to the library, Ambedkar shows the students the national frameworks he built that go unmentioned in modern political speeches. He was a master of macroeconomics. His research on currency and the rupee provided the blueprint used to establish the Reserve Bank of India. He faced massive resistance from Jawaharlal Nehru and conservative cabinet members when he introduced the Hindu Code Bill, which fought to give women equal rights in marriage and property for the first time. Finally, the man once denied a desk in the courtroom sat at the center of the Constituent Assembly as principal architect of the Indian Constitution. He famously described education as the milk of a lioness. He believed that for those denied every other weapon, a mastery of knowledge was the only way to demand a seat at the table. As Ambedkar fades away, Rohan and Aisha look at the Constitution again. They see a document designed by a scholar to ensure the rights of the citizen are protected by law, not by the pity of others.
When Sachin Tendulkar stepped onto a cricket pitch, talent was the only metric that mattered. The modern sports field is celebrated as the ultimate meritocracy. Decades earlier, another generational talent walked onto those exact same fields. Paul Wankar Balu was a legendary spin bowler, taking over 100 wickets on a 1911 tour of England. But despite this legendary status, he was also a delete. His athletic brilliance offered absolutely no protection off the pitch. During tea breaks, Balu was forced to drink from disposable clay cups. When the team ate lunch, he sat in total isolation. This strict segregation extended far beyond the boundaries of a sports stadium. Across the country, in thousands of villages, exclusion was the absolute rule of law. A young Bheem Ambedkar learned this math early. He once watched a village barber carefully groom the coarse hair of a buffalo. When the boy asked for a haircut, the barber refused. Touching the animal was fine. Touching a Dalit child was pollution. For Ambedkar, caste was an omnipresent disease. Raw talent, skill, and merit were rendered entirely useless in a society engineered to keep millions permanently at the bottom. That engineering started in the classroom. Ambedkar was forced to sit in the back on a burlap sack he had to bring from home. He couldn't even quench his own thirst. The classroom's communal water pitcher was strictly off-limits to the Dalit children. To survive a system explicitly designed to crush him, he needed overwhelming intellectual dominance. Participation was not enough. He had to outthink the architects of his oppression. He broke through the artificial ceiling of Indian society by securing scholarships to study abroad. He arrived at global institutions like Columbia University in New York, absorbing everything from political science to military sociology. This diagram visualizes the educational path of a standard Indian politician in the 1920s against the sprawling web of Ambedkar's academic record. He amassed 35 degrees and 3 doctorates, mastering economics, law, and the social sciences. By the time he returned to India, he was arguably the most highly educated citizen of his era. This education served a specific purpose. He was deliberately forging an intellectual arsenal to fight a war across every single layer of society. Ambedkar returned to India with doctorate degrees and global accolades, yet he found himself in an office where coworkers threw files at his desk to avoid his touch. He realized intellectual mastery was empty if the physical and economic structures of the village remained untouched. He launched legislative assaults on exploitative landlordism and the Mahar Vetan system of forced servitude, demanding economic dignity for agricultural laborers treated as property. His battle lines eventually crossed with international ideologies. When communist leader M.N. Roy visited Ambedkar in disguise, he expected a natural ally. Instead, Ambedkar dismantled Roy's communist framework, arguing the European class struggle ignored India's architecture. The caste barrier created ascending scales of hatred and descending scales of contempt that a simple labor revolution couldn't bridge. He applied that same ruthless logic to the heroes of the Indian independence movement. He bowed to no single dogma. He clashed openly with Mahatma Gandhi over the Varna system. While Gandhi viewed caste as an imperfect but reformable division of labor, Ambedkar refused to romanticize a structure built on inherent inequality. He demanded total annihilation of the system. Inside the newly formed cabinet, he fought Jawaharlal Nehru.
Ambedkar pushed aggressively for the Uniform Civil Code, seeking to codify equal property and marriage rights for women. When the government stalled, he resigned. His uncompromising pursuit of absolute equality forced him to stand completely alone. He fought the orthodox establishment, the communists, and the nationalists, all at the exact same time. This lifetime of brutal, multi-front warfare ultimately positioned him for his most enduring role, chief architect of the new nation's laws. Inside the Constituent Assembly, he transformed his lived trauma into permanent legal armor for millions. He meticulously designed the Indian Constitution to eradicate the precise discrimination he had survived. The text explicitly outlawed untouchability and guaranteed equal access to wells, roads, and classrooms. Modern politics frequently compartmentalizes Ambedkar's legacy within the boundaries of Dalit activism. However, the legal architecture he built protects every laborer and guarantees property rights for every woman, regardless of their background. He left future generations with a strict, active command: educate, agitate, organize. True equality is never handed down by the privileged. It must be intelligently architected and aggressively defended on every front, every single day.
It's 2 a.m. Your eyes are burning, the coffee is gone, and that stack of textbooks feels like a physical weight pressing down on your chest. You find yourself trapped in the mid-semester grind, viewing education as an endless rat race, a heavy burden of obligations you're desperate to escape. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar looked at that same academic pursuit through a different lens. He called education lioness's milk, noting that whoever drinks it roars. To understand that roar, imagine a world where every page in your bag is a prize you are violently forbidden from touching. In 1890s India, social hierarchy was law. Born into the Mahar caste, Ambedkar entered a world that branded him untouchable from birth, enforcing a systemic exclusion that governed every aspect of his childhood. At school, segregation was physical. He was barred from the classroom, forced to sit outside on the veranda on a gunny sack he carried from home each day to avoid polluting the floor.
Hydration was a matter of caste. He was forbidden from direct contact with the school's water supply, waiting for a high-caste peon to pour water into his cupped hands from a safe distance. If the peon was absent, he stayed thirsty. The humiliation extended to the roads. When he and his brother hired a bullock cart to visit their father, the driver, discovering their caste, abruptly threw them into the dirt under the midday sun. The pressure almost worked. As a teenager, Ambedkar contemplated stealing a half-anna coin from his aunt to fund a quiet escape to the textile mills of Mumbai, trading his education for a life of manual labor. He put the coin back. He realized that running away only accepted the status quo. To break the system, he had to weaponize his mind through the very knowledge society tried to deny him. By 1913, that defiance had carried him from the veranda of a village school to the campus of Columbia University in New York. This shows the scale of the intellectual arsenal he built over his lifetime. He amassed 35 distinct academic credentials, including 3 separate PhD degrees from leading global institutions. He mastered 9 languages and achieved deep authority across law, economics, political science, and sociology. Ambedkar was engineering a level of intellectual gravity that the world could no longer ignore. He utilized these credentials to force a seat at the table in a society that had spent centuries keeping him at the gate. Education became his method of asymmetric warfare, a way to exert power when he had no physical or political standing. Armed with his expertise, he returned to India and began dismantling the logic of the status quo from the top down. He challenged Mahatma Gandhi directly, dismissing symbolic gestures like temple entry in favor of a demand for absolute equality and separate political electorates for the marginalized. He brought this fight to the international stage in London, using his legal mastery to represent Dalit rights before the highest levels of British government. Years later, he resigned from Prime Minister Nehru's cabinet because he refused to compromise on the Hindu Code Bill, insisting on codified legal rights for women in marriage and property. His academic superiority made him the only person in India capable of legally deconstructing the system from within. He reached the ultimate position of influence as the chief architect of the Indian Constitution. He used that role to bake equal rights into the nation's foundation, legally outlining the very practices of untouchability that once denied him water. Now, I want you to look back at those heavy textbooks on your desk. They represent inherited power. Every page you read is a component of a privilege that was bought through decades of social and intellectual struggle. Dr. Ambedkar's powerful directive to us remains: educate, agitate, organize. Your education is the weapon you use to shape what comes next. Drink the milk. It's time to roar.
Today, if you look at how political parties talk about Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, they paint him strictly as a Dalit leader, a convenient vote bank mascot brought out for rallies and anniversaries. Wrapping him in garlands actually suffocates his true identity. We lose sight of the fiercely independent intellectual who spent his entire life dismantling the most powerful orthodoxies of his time. To understand where that fierce independence came from, we have to look at the world he was born into. This was an era defined by a level of cruelty that is hard to even comprehend today. People from lower castes were subjected to a mandate known as the matka and jadu. They were forced to tie a heavy earthen pot around their necks, simply to catch their own spit so it wouldn't touch the ground. At the same time, they had to drag a broom tied to their waists. As they walked, the bristles would sweep away their footprints, literally erasing any evidence that their impure bodies had walked on the earth. Dr. Ambedkar's lifelong mission emerged directly from this desperate fight for basic human existence and dignity against a system designed to erase him. This chart illustrates a typical educational path compared to Dr. Ambedkar's. He weaponized education to fight that oppressive system, eventually mastering 9 different languages and earning 35 academic degrees. His pursuit of knowledge pushed him into global academic powerhouses, starting with intense studies in economics and sociology at Columbia University in New York. From there, he expanded his expertise at the London School of Economics, tackling complex economic and legal theories. We often hear the story of his academic rise as a solo triumph, ignoring the silent, crushing sacrifices made by his wife, Ramabai. While he was studying abroad, Ramabai was left navigating extreme poverty back in India. She kept the household running by making and selling cow dung cakes for fuel. That lack of basic resources carried a devastating emotional toll. Out of their 5 children, 4 died young because the family simply could not afford adequate medical care. The man who would eventually write the legal framework for modern India was also a grieving father and husband. His global intellect was paid for by unimaginable personal tragedy. In his intellectual prime, Ambedkar refused to align with popular narratives. He became a fearless truth-teller, subjecting political giants to objective scrutiny. He clashed directly with Mahatma Gandhi over the approach to the caste system and untouchability. Ambedkar publicly called out what he saw as hypocrisy. He pointed out that Gandhi published progressive, anti-caste views in his English newspaper for Western audiences, while simultaneously publishing conservative, caste-affirming views in his Gujarati newspaper, Deen Bandhu. He was equally critical of Jawaharlal Nehru. Ambedkar designed the Hindu Code Bill to grant equal property and marriage rights to women, but Nehru and the Congress resisted the legislation. The tension grew so severe that the Congress Party actively campaigned against Ambedkar. They even backed his own former assistant in an election, defeating Ambedkar by 17,000 votes. His scrutiny extended deeply into religion as well. He rigorously fought Hindu orthodoxy and the rigid rules of the Manusmriti, but he applied that exact same critical lens to Islamic fundamentalism in Thoughts on Pakistan. In that book, he argued that the nature of Islamic Brotherhood at the time was inherently exclusionary. He wrote that it prioritized strict religious loyalty over national unity, often viewing non-Muslims as outsiders. By challenging both Hindu and Islamic orthodoxies, along with the most powerful political leaders of the era, he proved he belonged to no single party's agenda. He was an intellectual fiercely loyal only to truth and equality. Yet his social reform is only a fraction of his legacy. Dr. Ambedkar was an economic and infrastructural visionary. His rigorous academic thesis on the problem of the rupee provided the direct financial and structural framework that led to the creation of the Reserve Bank of India. Looking at this map of India's waterways, you can see the scale of his infrastructural planning. He was the original architect behind the concept of river linking and the establishment of major dam projects designed to secure the nation's water and power grids.
All of these experiences culminated in his pivotal role in the Constituent Assembly, where he drafted the comprehensive legal framework of the modern Indian state. The republic he helped design in those chambers continues to function and evolve today, proving that his structural legacy far outlasted his contemporary detractors. Dr. Ambedkar's true identity cannot be contained in a sanitized political mascot. He was arguably the most highly educated, objective, and visionary leader in India's modern history. For a new generation, showing true respect for his legacy requires moving past the worship of statues. It means daring to read his unfiltered works, engaging with his hardest questions, and carrying forward his uncompromising pursuit of progress.